Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar session on immunity in the kitchen. I'm Zoe Ellis, the Head of Consumer Medical Affairs at Nutricia and your chair for this evening. This evening, we're really excited to have both Dr. Caroline Childs and nutritionist Katie Angotti joining us. Caroline is a lecturer in nutritional sciences within medicine at the University of Southampton, and her expertise in research spans across various nutrients such as prebiotics, fatty acids, and probiotics, and their effects on the immune system. Following her talk on the close links between our diet and the developing immune system in the early years, I'm sure you'll see why she has received multiple awards for her teaching excellence. Following Caroline's session, nutritionist Katie will join us. Katie is a registered public health nutritionist and health coach whose work spans both the NHS and the food industry, and now she's working freelance as a pregnancy and weaning nutritionist. She specializes in helping new parents to make positive choices when feeding themselves and their babies, and her talk will provide short, simple, and practical actions that can help parents incorporate appropriate foods into their diet during weaning and throughout toddlerhood. The presentations will be around 20 to 25 minutes long. During the talks, please submit your questions via the Q&A box to the bottom right of this video. Following the talk, there will be dedicated time for a live Q&A session where these questions will be answered. So don't miss the chance to ask those questions that are on your mind throughout the session. And now, without further ado, we will move on to Caroline's talk. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you for that introduction. I just wanted to share, this is where I usually work. So this is the Institute of Developmental Sciences based at the hospital site at the hospital in Southampton. So I spend half my time teaching medical students about nutrition and metabolism, and the other half of my time doing my own research on the effect that nutrition has on the immune system. And I just want to acknowledge that the work I do is part of a much larger team of researchers. And here's a picture of us on a sunny day some time ago outside our building. So the plan for my talk with you is to go through a quick introduction to your immune system. The immune system is a really large topic. People like me can do a whole PhD on a small aspect of the immune system. So I'm going to try and give you an overview to cover what I think are some of the key concepts. And one of those is the really close interactions that your gut bacteria or gut microbiome have with your immune system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the diet that we have and our environment affects our immune system, interacts with our gut microbiome, and how those things are particularly important in the early days of life. Okay, so a quick introduction to the immune system first. So our immune system is a complex mix of organs, tissues, cells, specific locations all around our body. So for example, you may have heard of your spleen, which sits just behind your stomach. Your thymus, where your T cells mature, is a gland that sits just in front of your heart. And you've probably felt your lymph nodes in your neck, for example, swelling up when you've had a cold or flu-like illness. And that's a tissue getting larger because there are a growing number of immune cells proliferating and dividing, ready to fight against the infection that you're tackling. So we have these specialized tissues and organs all around our body, and the function of our immune system is to help identify things which are ourself and that we should tolerate and leave them alone, and things which are not us and that we may need to destroy or eliminate as quickly as possible. So our immune system is part of our normal response to infection by bacteria. So this is a picture of some salmonella here, viruses, fungi, parasites. It can give us a degree of protection against the growth of cancerous cells. Our immune system is also part of our normal responses when we're injured, whether that's because you've fallen over and broken your arm, or whether that's because you've had surgery and so have an injury to recover from a surgical procedure. And our immune system in health is protective for us, and so beneficial to us in protecting us against these infections or challenges that we may have faced in our day-to-day life. One of the wonderful complexities about working in research with the immune system is how complicated it is. So here's a little schematic which was drawn by a second-year medical student. So I'm afraid to say this is quite a basic image of all the different interactions between cells of your immune system. But people like me in the laboratory, we can take blood samples, have a look at immune cells. We can look at particular types of cells. So for example, I could say, I'm really interested in T cells. I can look at the signals they produce. So perhaps I can say, I'm really interested in production of interleukin-4 because I know that's associated with an increased risk of allergic disease. But really, this is a very small fragment of a very large overall picture. And I would encourage you to think of your immune system as this orchestra of cells all working together, and perhaps looking at this very fine detail of what's happening in these signaling molecules would be a bit like looking at flute player number 3 in the orchestra. And really what we're interested in is, how is the overall conduct of our immune system behaving? Overall, are we able to effectively fight infections when we encounter them? Overall, do we have inappropriate allergic responses to things in our environment? So that's how we can get an overall picture of how our immune system is working, I would suggest. And you can, of course, research more about all these specific cell types and their functions. And that's what people like me do in our laboratory. If you would like a primer to the immune system, last year I read this really nice article summarising immunology in the Atlantic, so I would encourage you to check out that article, which I think gave a very nice overview of the complexities of your immune system and how you might think about how it works. I also want to highlight to you how dynamic your immune system is. This is a video here of a white blood cell called a neutrophil chasing around a bacteria. You can see it moving its way around, following the chemical signal by that bacteria, and now has engulfed it, ready to destroy it. So I want you to think about how active this cell is. It's going to need energy to be able to be so active, to meet its own requirements. It's going to need the right kind of building blocks to have the functions that it has to change shape, to engulf, to destroy. It's going to need all those building blocks for those processes to happen effectively. And this is where nutrition becomes important, because nutrition provides the energy that our immune cells need to do that, and also the key components that it needs to have those functions effectively once it's caught up with that bacteria and engulfed it. Okay, so let's think about what happens in the immune system in early life. Newborns have what we could describe as an immature immune system, but they do still have immune function. There are some antibodies which can pass from mother to child across the placenta, and the fetus and the newborn can produce antibodies themselves as well. And so this is the principle by which, for example, women during pregnancy are encouraged to have the flu vaccination, whooping cough vaccination, so some of that protection from the mother can pass to the child before they themselves are old enough to have their own vaccinations. We know that things can start to go a little bit wrong in early life as well. So allergens can reach the fetus in utero, and we know that newborns, particularly very small newborns or premature infants or low birth weight infants, are particularly susceptible to infections and serious consequences as a result. There's also some characteristic patterns that we see in immune function in the early days of life, and some of you may have first-hand experience of this. I know I am an adult who had eczema as a child, used to get a red rash around my mouth after having milk, then developed asthma in childhood, and now as an adult have hay fever every summer. And so we have these characteristic changes in allergic disease, with food allergy and eczema quite commonly presenting in the early years of life, asthma typically presenting in kind of early primary school ages, and rhinitis or hay fever being something which lasts a little longer. So we have these characteristic changes in what happens with our immune system in early life as well. But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how our immune cells interact with what's happening in our gut. And I think this is a nice little cartoon here showing a dendritic cell reaching out into the gut lumen, trying to sample what's there so that it can send messages back to immune cells of whether there's something there that needs action to be taken, or whether this is something which should be tolerated. Of course, the real picture is a little more complex than that, but the same principles apply. We can see here this dendritic cell reaching through, sampling bacteria in the gut lumen, these specialized regions of immune tissue, which can effect actions if required, so these Peyer's patches in our immune system. And it's also a two-way street. Our immune cells can also send antibodies, here's immunoglobulin A, being secreted into the gut and coating bacteria, targeting them for destruction or making it harder for them to adhere to the gut surface. So we have this two-way communication happening all the time between what's in our gut and the immune cells in and around our gut area. And I want you to think a little bit about the constant and massive challenge we present our immune system each day. So if we eat something that contains salmonella, we want our immune system to exert a strong and protective response so that we can eliminate that bacteria before it has a chance to cause us serious illness or worse. But then when we eat food or are exposed to friendly bacteria in our gut, we don't want to have an excessive response to those. We want to be able to tolerate those. And so we have this real challenge in our immune system of being strong and protective when danger is encountered, but being tolerant when we're exposed to what we might consider normal exposures. In early life, this was a really wonderful study that was produced recently to try and understand what are the factors that drive development of an infant's immune system. They took samples from parents, followed the children over a period of time, and looked to see what were the predictors of what happened later in their immune system. There were some patterns they saw. For example, being born early was associated with a more inflammatory type response, but there were also challenges. There's a great deal of diversity in immune responses in infants. So there were challenges when they tried to work with cord blood, and there was lots of variability amongst infants compared to what's seen in adults. But one thing they did conclude was that responses to microbes, especially those in the gut, are very likely to be drivers of immune system development in newborn children in the first few weeks of life. So what's happening there in the gut being a key part of how your immune system develops. There are a number of factors which have the potential in our diet to influence our immune system in early life, and one, of course, is breast milk. Breast milk, as well as providing the energy that's required for an infant and the building blocks required for them to grow, also contains a number of immune components. I've listed some here: complement proteins, antibodies, secretory IgA, for example, and there's a few which I'm going to focus on specifically in my talk today. So one is cytokines, signaling molecules produced by immune cells. Another are these specialized carbohydrates called human milk oligosaccharides, and long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. I'm going to focus on these because those are the main areas which I do my research in. But of course, there are many other immune components found within breast milk as well. And this recent paper gave a very nice overview of the specific breast milk microbiome or bacteria found within breast milk and how that interacts with an infant's gut and immune development. So all these immune components in breast milk can provide a degree of passive immunity from the mother and also promotes maturation of the gut and all the gut associated immune tissue that we have. So let's take one example of what's found in breast milk here. So this was a study which looked at cytokines found within human breast milk. And here they're looking at two cytokines which are very characteristic. So TNF-alpha associated with inflammation, and IL-10 considered to be an inflammation resolving signal in your immune system. And the first thing I want to highlight to you is how much variation there is within and between populations in terms of these immune components within breast milk. So for example, if we look at breast milk samples collected from women in Spain, you can see there's a massive variation in the proportion of these cytokines that they have in their milk. And in this study, they looked at a number of countries and contexts, and you can see that there's really very different patterns between breast milk, for example, in Ghana here, compared to the west coast of the United States. So there's massive variation within and between populations. So, for example, in this study, they detected TNF-alpha in the majority of studies collected in the United States, but only half the studies that were found in Spain. And this inflammation-resolving cytokine was found in every sample collected in Kenya, but not detected in samples in Sweden or the United States. And so we're really at the early stages of understanding what these signals tell us, but we can certainly see these huge differences between individuals and between nations. Another component of human breast milk is human milk oligosaccharides. These are highly abundant in human breast milk, 10 to 20 grams per litre. That's as much as there is protein content in breast milk, so a really significant component. And there are two effects by which we understand these may impact on infant health. One is a prebiotic effect, so encouraging the growth of friendly bacteria in the infant gut. And the other is by having direct effects on the immune system. And that's some of the work which one of my PhD students is investigating. How might prebiotic molecules interact directly with immune cells? Human milk oligosaccharides are interesting because the quantity and type of human milk oligosaccharide found in breast milk varies between women. And this is based upon their genetic background. So some women have genes for producing particular types of human milk oligosaccharides, and some women don't have those genes. And it's the same genes which determine your blood group type, for example, are involved in whether you have the enzymes that allow you to produce one type or another. So again, another growing area of research, a great deal of interest in the role these human milk oligosaccharides have on immune function. Beyond the diet, there are other exposures which affect us. There are other exposures which lead us to be exposed to bacteria in our environment. So, for example, pet ownership is known to be protective against developing allergic diseases. So if you have young children at home, you can think about whether you also have a furry pet, and that will make it less likely that they are going to develop allergic diseases. There are other exposures known to link with risks of things linked to the immune system, so antibiotic use in early life. And then we can think about what we find on the skin or gut microorganisms of the mother, the mode of birth that the child was born by, and the timing and type of foods that a child is introduced to. All of these things have an impact on the gut microbiome and are linked to immune outcomes. Here's an example of some data which demonstrates that. There are communities in the United States which follow very traditional farming backgrounds. Amish lifestyle is a very farming-based community. And there is another community, the Hutterite community, which is also farming-based, but the difference is in Hutterite communities, they have farms as a workplace that they travel to, and then they return home, whereas in Amish communities, they're living within a farming environment. And it's been observed that children in Amish communities have a much lower prevalence of asthma compared to children in Hutterite communities, and that's been linked to their exposures to bacteria in their environment. So being in this farming environment seems to be giving these children a degree of protection against developing allergic disease. And they could even link that to the levels of endotoxin, which is a marker of gram-negative bacteria in the dust within their home, was linked very closely to what was happening in the prevalence of allergic disease here. In terms of what we might see from intervention studies, here's an example of a study which was done using probiotics. In this study, pregnant women who had a family history of allergic disease were randomized to either a probiotic or a control, and then their infants were followed up, and at 2 years of age, they had a look to see how many of those infants had eczema. A third of the children overall developed eczema from this study, but you can see that this was much more likely to occur amongst children within the control group compared to those on the probiotic intervention study. Now, of course, this is just one study, and in terms of getting the highest quality evidence in science, the way we try to do that is to do something called a meta-analysis or a systematic review, and that's where we take studies with similar investigations of probiotics from a number of different research centres conducted independently to see whether they find the same pattern of results. And here's a meta-analysis of this type of study. And you can see that overall, by putting together all these various studies which have taken place, they can see that it suggests that there is a protective effect of using probiotics against the development of eczema in early life in children. And this particularly seems to occur when a mixture of probiotic strains is used, and particularly with a focus in early life. So studies which have looked later in life perhaps have not seen such strong effects. So this is the kind of evidence which I like to use in my own reading to try and understand what is likely to be occurring with these dietary exposures and how they link to immune function. Another nutrient which I have a great deal of research interest in is omega-3 fatty acids. The essential omega-3 fatty acid in our diet is alpha-linolenic acid, and most of us are consuming between 1 and 2 grams of this a day from green leafy vegetables or cooking oils. But the other omega-3s you may have heard of are these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DPA and DHA. And these are things which we typically consume in oily fish, but the complication is that only a quarter of people in the UK ever eat oily fish. So for the rest of the population, their exposures are probably coming from other meats, for example, or eggs can contain some of these as well. So I've been very interested in the effect that these long-chain omega-3s may have on immune function. And the reason these are interesting is because of the way they affect the physical properties of cells. I want you to cast your mind back to that video I showed you at the beginning of that cell, which needed to be highly active to engulf that bacteria and destroy it. So in cell membranes, we have this phospholipid bilayer, which is made up of a head group and 2 fatty acid tails. And for every double bond the fatty acid has, it puts a little kink in that tail. And the more kinks there are, the more fluid and flexible the membrane becomes. So omega-3 fatty acids are interesting because they contain a very high number of these double bonds in their structures. DHA here containing 6 double bonds in its structure, giving it an almost corkscrew-like appearance, making membranes highly flexible. And so by changing the fluidity of the membrane, there's a number of ways omega-3 fatty acids can have an effect. They change the availability of building blocks for inflammatory signals. Omega-3 fatty acids are broadly considered to exert less pro-inflammatory signaling pathways. They affect the function of proteins in the membrane. If a protein needs to undergo a big conformational shape change, it can do that better in a highly fluid membrane. And that can affect how cells interact together and whether they're able to form a stable connection to send signals from one to the other. So in terms of what's been seen for consumption of omega-3 and the risk of allergic disease, there's some epidemiological evidence or observational studies which have seen, for example, populations which eat large quantities of oily fish tend to have a low incidence of asthma and allergic disease. And then this was followed up by some studies, particularly in Australia, where they looked at intakes amongst children, and they found that children who were eating a high amount of omega-6 fatty acids tended to have a higher risk of childhood asthma, whereas children who regularly consumed fresh oily fish had a reduced risk of asthma. So these are observational studies rather than intervention studies, but those intervention studies are coming, and the evidence there is growing as well. And the thing I would like to highlight again is to remind you of this path of allergic disease that we see. And so if you want to intervene in a way which is going to reduce the risk of asthma or allergic disease, when is going to be the best timing to do that if these are things which develop quite early in life? And so for that reason, there's a large body of research which has looked at what's known as fetal programming, or the developmental origins of health and disease. And so if we wish to prevent childhood asthma, is this something which needs to happen during an intervention during pregnancy, breastfeeding, or earlier than that? And is the effect going to be the same for the mother as well? Will there be impacts on the mother of such an intervention? Is it the same for all infants? Is it particularly valuable for early or small babies, for example? So there are a number of studies which have started to investigate this, and I think this is something which evidence will develop over years to come as we understand a bit more about these impacts on the immune system. It is complicated, however, with giving advice around oily fish. So the current UK advice is to have 2 portions of fish a week, including 1 portion of oily fish. But women are advised to restrict their intakes of fish at the top of the food chain because they could contain methyl mercury contamination. But it's a very tricky balance between the risks of exposure to contamination versus the potential protective effects of those omega-3 in fish. And a research group which has looked at this in great detail is the Seychelles Child Development Study. This is a population which has a very high background intake of fish, but from quite polluted waters, and not just from human pollution, but also volcanic pollution. And they've highlighted that there are really complex interactions between protection received by eating these omega-3 fatty acids versus the risks of exposure to those pollutants or contaminants in the fish itself. So I hope that in my talk I've shown you the complexities of the immune system, that there are a number of overlapping functions between cell types, and that there are these key developmental stages as we grow up. There are a number of very important interactions between how our immune system works and our gut microbiome. And both of these are influenced by the environment in which we live and the diet that we consume. But it's complex giving dietary advice to support immune function, whether that's by foods which are targeting the gut microbiome or foods which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to hearing any questions you might have.
Thank you, Caroline, for delivering such an interesting session. You did a great job of explaining some of the complexities of the immune system and how nutrients such as oligosaccharides and fatty acids support immune development. So thank you so much for sharing. Now, to everyone listening in, please do not forget to type in your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom right of your screen and submit them for the Q&A, which is coming up after Katie's talk. And now we have Katie's talk. Thanks, Katie. Over to you.
Thanks, Zoe. I am Katie Angotti. I'm a registered public health nutritionist and I specialise in maternal and infant nutrition. So I'm going to share with you some practical guidance that you can use when supporting parents to bring foods to support children's immune system into the kitchen. So what are we going to cover? Well, I'm going to talk to you first about some of the food sources of those key nutrients that are needed to support a healthy immune system. Then I'm going to come on to how to introduce these foods safely during complementary feeding. And then finally, I will leave you with some practical tips for encouraging diet diversity in the toddler years and beyond. And I'll also weave in some practical considerations for when buying these foods on a budget. Now, often when we picture what a perfect, quote unquote, perfect healthy diet to support the immune system might look like, we might be thinking of something that costs a lot of money, that takes a lot of planning, and that includes some really complex food combinations, which may seem a little bit too much for the average parent planning what their baby or toddler needs to eat. But I really love this statement that the World Health Organization put out on their website during the pandemic. They state that a diverse diet with a colourful mix of fruits and vegetables, as well as grains and proteins, including beans, nuts, seeds, meat, chicken, fish and eggs, will help keep your child's immune system strong. Also, dark green leafy vegetables and orange and yellow coloured fruits and vegetables are especially good for their immunity. And I don't know about you, but when it's put like that, it doesn't feel so complicated or unattainable for the vast majority of parents that I work with in my clinics. It basically comes down to offering a wide variety of foods in a wide range of colours. But as I have a few more minutes to fill, we are going to talk about some more of the specific nutrients to bear in mind. So first up, vitamin A. Now, vitamin A is provided by animal products, mainly in our diet, in the form of retinol. So those are things like fish, eggs, milk, yogurts, cheese. If, however, you are vegetarian and vegan and avoiding these foods, you can also get vitamin A from things that are yellow and red, so carrots, sweet potatoes, peppers, green leafy vegetables, and those brightly coloured yellow fruits such as mangoes and papayas and apricots. Because vitamin A is stored in the body, we don't actually need to have this in the diet every day. So these are foods that can be offered across the course of the week. Vitamin C is another important nutrient for the immune system and one most people are very familiar with. It's found in the vast majority of fruits and vegetables, in particular citrus fruits, broccoli, potatoes, strawberries, blackcurrants. Because vitamin C isn't stored in the body, it is something that we need to try and have in the diet every day. And for people who are really struggling to get enough fruit and vegetables into their diets, particularly for children, this is why Healthy Start vitamins contain vitamin C. Vitamin D is another one that most of us are very familiar with now, particularly if you work with young children. And we know that food sources of vitamin D are quite limited. So foods such as oily fish, eggs, some types of mushrooms, and some fortified breakfast cereals are the only way that we can really get vitamin D in our diet. And for children in particular, it's really hard to get enough of those food sources into their diet, which is why vitamin D needs to be supplemented in the under fives. Iron is another important nutrient for supporting a healthy immune system. It either comes from meat sources in the form of heme iron, so red meat, oily fish, or it comes from plant sources in the form of non-heme iron. This would be things like whole grains, beans and nuts, green leafy vegetables, and dried fruits. Although iron is stored in the body, we need to have it in the diet every day because it is so important. And for people who are avoiding meat and oily fish, it's especially important to include a source of vitamin C alongside the iron-rich foods. And vitamin C helps your body to absorb as much iron as possible from those foods. Another mineral that is important for the immune system is zinc. Now, the vast majority of people will get enough zinc in their diet just by eating a variety of foods, but it is found in meat, dairy products, peas, beans and lentils, whole grains, cereals, nuts and seeds. Because it isn't stored in the body, we need to have it daily. But as I said, it's one that is in so many foods and we need such a small amount of it. The vast majority of people will easily get this in their diet. Coming on to the omega-3 fats, the main source of these fats in the diet will be oily fish. Now, these are foods that often aren't eaten in great quantities by babies and toddlers, although if you do introduce them from an early age, they are readily accepted. And with more people becoming plant-based, these are foods which might not be appropriate in the diet. So you can get omega-3 fats from foods such as nuts and seeds and the plant oils that are made from these nuts and seeds, in particular flax seeds, walnuts and chia seeds. Now, omega-3s are a type of fat that are stored in the body, so we don't need to eat these foods every day. It can just be eaten a few times a week, and many people might opt for a supplement to help with this nutrient. Now, another few things that are not strictly nutrients. So firstly, prebiotics. Prebiotic fibers actually are found in a lot of plant-based foods. Lots of things like vegetables such as onions, leeks, asparagus, garlic, sweet corn, and cabbage. The legume family, which would be things like chickpeas, lentils, kidney beans, all kinds of beans, and many fruits, in particular apples, bananas, and watermelon, all of which are foods which can be introduced to babies and children very early. And then finally, probiotics are important for the immune system as well. Generally speaking, probiotics are found in fermented foods, and this would include things such as sauerkraut, kefir, yogurt, miso, sourdoughs, and some soft cheeses. Now, all of these things can be provided through supplements as well, but as we generally focus on foods because of all the variety of nutrients and the other health benefits they give, these are the things that we want to start introducing to children from the weaning age. Which brings us on to how do we actually bring these foods into the diets of children? So, as I said, all of these foods can be introduced from 6 months of age. Some of them might need adapting slightly, but there's no reason that we can't have these foods in the diet of babies. When we are thinking about introducing solids at around 6 months, focusing on starting with vegetables and then fruits, meats, beans, pulses and fortified cereals are a great way to provide that variety of those different nutrients that I've mentioned. In particular, when we're starting with things like vegetables, beans and pulses, those high fiber foods, it is important to remind parents to start quite slowly, as these foods are likely to cause some constipation if we introduce them too quickly. And of course, any of those foods that you are choosing to introduce which are allergens, it's important to introduce them individually, one at a time from 6 months, unless the baby is at very high risk of developing an allergy. So when it comes to textures and making sure these foods are appropriate to eat, If the family is following a baby-led weaning approach, making sure those foods are soft and squashable, that they can easily be squished between the fingers, is the best way to do that. If the family is going down a pureed, a more traditional weaning route, making sure that they are clear to only stick with purees for a short while, because we know that those purees are breaking down those beneficial fibres, so babies aren't getting the benefit of the fibre there. And moving quickly on to mashed foods, which allows the baby to learn how to move those foods around in their mouth. Most of the questions I get from parents are around how to then transition from those single taste individual foods onto meals, and at what age to do that. And really, we want to be encouraging parents to do that fairly quickly. So we don't need to spend a long time on single foods. And actually, you want parents and babies to be eating the same food as soon as possible, aiming for a variety of different foods across the week and gradually building to a pattern of 3 meals by the time baby's around 10 to 12 months. One point I think is really important to mention and to remind parents of is that every baby is very different, and there is no strict feeding schedule or timeline for when they need to start offering 3 meals. Some babies might be having 3 meals by 8 months, some might not be till 10 months. It really doesn't matter as long as it fits and it works for the baby and the family. And importantly, when it comes to introducing foods, as I mentioned, all of those foods can be introduced from 6 months. There are very few foods that babies need to avoid during weaning. Really, they are just any added salt, any added sugar, honey, low-fat products, and nuts that are whole. Obviously, we can adapt nuts in the form of ground nuts or nut butters to make them suitable for babies. So what does that then look like when we think about the actual food on the plate? Well, there are lots of ways that you can combine foods to help give a broad variety of those nutrients that I mentioned. I wouldn't ever encourage parents to think about food in this level of detail, but what you can take from this is that moving away from single foods in those first weeks of weaning and focusing on the variety of mixing foods together will give babies all the nutrients that they need and that we talked about in terms of supporting their immune system. So a great example might be something like a leek and potato mash, where leeks are a great source of prebiotics. Potatoes, when you leave the skin on, are a good source of vitamin C. And then you can add in other nutrients depending on what you mix it with. So adding some cheese will give you that vitamin A and zinc. Adding some salmon or flax seeds will give you the omegas, or adding some beef or lentils will give you some iron. So you can see that it starts to build up a broad picture of a very balanced meal just by combining 2 to 3 different foods. A key message to give to parents then is that they need to try and have more than one food group in a meal. So when you're having vegetables, trying to add in a source of protein or a dairy food, so that we make sure babies are getting that variety. And don't be afraid to give virtually any food that the family is eating, just making it suitable for the baby. So for example, omelette, chopping it into fingers and making sure that it's got perhaps a green vegetable in there and some dairy in the form of cheese. When it comes to probiotics in particular, things like Greek yogurt, natural yogurt are a great source of probiotics and a really straightforward, simple and cheap way to introduce those to babies. And these kinds of things actually track through into toddlers and when we start thinking about toddler diet diversity as well. So one of the main things that we as health professionals can do to support parents with their toddlers eating is actually focus on what is developmentally normal for the toddler and how that relates to eating, rather than encouraging parents to, again, focus on these specific nutrients. So what that looks like is allowing parents to really understand what these developmental norms are. We know that toddlers are likely to be very skeptical. They don't like new things. But what we do know is that they will also learn to like new things through familiarization and starting to taste them. So we can reassure parents that it's perfectly normal for their toddler to start rejecting foods and they should expect it. We know that toddlers can be very erratic. What they like on one day, they hate the next. Their appetites vary drastically from day to day, but it's all very normal and to be expected at this age, so not a huge cause for concern. toddlers are also very opinionated. They're starting to find their voice. They can be very clear about what they do and don't want, whether they've got the words to say it or whether it's through actions. And you cannot make a toddler do something that they don't want to do. By helping a parent really understand this, they can then think about, okay, let's be more calm at the meal times. These are things that we can come to expect. I can think more broadly about their diet and not get worried. How can we feed toddlers through this, what sounds like a very challenging time? Well, we can practice something called the division of responsibility, and parents can provide structure and limits without being too controlling. What this looks like in practice is that parents are responsible for the what, the when, and the where of feeding, and the child is responsible for how much and whether or not to eat. To be able to support this, it's important to have consistency and structure. So having 3 meals and 2 planned snacks throughout the day, ideally offered at the same time of the day where possible. Trying to have family meals, so everybody's sitting around the table, everybody serving themselves from the table, allowing toddlers to see that the other family members are eating the same foods as them, and ensuring that the environment is pleasant and conducive to a happy meal time. So no distractions from TV and tablets. Everybody is present and is talking to each other, and there's ultimately no pressure on the toddler or anyone else to eat. And in order to make it really easy for toddlers to take part in the meal times, we need to choose foods that make that process simple. So by cooking one meal for the whole family, but making it toddler friendly, that allows toddlers to see that they can eat the same foods as everybody else. They're not being isolated and made to feel different. When we do want to offer toddlers new foods, which we should do, we can pair it with something that we know they already like. So there's a degree of familiarization there. Something that works really well is to ensure that there is more than one starchy food on offer. Having something like bread on the table is a great option because it means that you know there is something that is particularly safe for a child to eat. And making sure that the foods that are served are really easy for your toddler to pick up and chew will be just make it that little bit extra, that little bit more simple for the toddler to take part in the meal and not get frustrated by it. So when it comes to actually planning meals then for family eating, to involve all of these nutrients that we talked about and to take into consideration these factors of starting weaning or dealing with toddler development, what are the key messages that we can encourage parents to think about? Well, as I mentioned, I don't encourage parents to think about the specific nutrients. Instead, I would encourage them to think about offering the 4 main food groups across the course of the day. So 5 portions of starchy carbs, 5 servings of veg and fruit, 3 servings of dairy and alternatives, and 2 to 3 servings of protein-rich foods, but not getting hung up if on one day of the week their toddler doesn't necessarily want to eat that amount. Encouraging them to offer food regularly. Toddlers get hungry quickly. They need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. So having that structure of 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks gives them the opportunity to eat regularly throughout the day. Including dessert or sweet things as part of the meal and avoiding that perception of food, of dessert being a reward and something to look forward to. Having dessert as part of the main meal makes it just another food that toddlers can choose to eat or choose not to eat if they want to. And finally, making sure that the food actually tastes good. It's important to include things like healthy fats and oils and to offer herbs and spices and get kids involved in preparing, tasting and serving food, as that really allows them to feel in control and part of the meal. And then finally, making sure that these foods are fitting in with a family budget. There are so many options available that really do work within budgets, even when it comes to things like omegas. That people might feel that are a little bit more expensive. There are lots of omega-3 fish fingers that are out there that are very, very cheap to buy. Even things like ground flaxseed, which might appear to be a little more pricey, you can get from supermarkets such as Aldi and Lidl for quite cheap. Things that are frozen are often much cheaper than their fresh counterparts and actually are a really great source of those nutrients because they're frozen so quickly after picking. Plain yogurts, fortified cereals, eggs and tinned beans are fantastic sources of the nutrients that we mentioned. So I hope that gives you lots of tips and ideas for how to encourage parents to bring these foods into their babies and toddlers' diets, and also some practical tips for how to get them to eat the foods as well.